So I've spent a lot of time looking at this week's Parsha, Bo, trying to understand the idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. There is so much commentary from our sages and medieval commentators. And as I always do, I wanted to understand what we can learn about our own lives from our sacred texts. And so I will suggest the following. The plagues are punishments against Pharaoh. Essentially, Pharaoh took the free will of the Israelites, enslaving them and oppressing them. He took away their choice of work, time with their families, and sometimes he took their lives. He even took away the right to have children when he decreed that the male babies were to be killed. He did not treat the Israelites like human beings. And so with every plague, God takes away Pharaoh's free will. His heart was already hard with cruelty and becomes harder and harder as he faces the reality of God's power and the loss of his own ability to control his life and his actions. And then, with the death of his own son, his heart breaks. He becomes heartless, and he chases the Israelites into the wilderness. We struggle with these passages because we don't believe today that God acts in our lives as directly as God acted in the lives of Moses and Pharaoh. And we certainly don't want to believe that God would harden someone's heart as if it were some kind of torture. But our sages do assert that God has a point to make about God's presence. Our biblical authors make it clear that our Torah, in its time, was asserting monotheism, and it was necessary to demonstrate God's unique role in the world and to disprove Egyptian polytheism. In its historical context, we know that Judaism did not develop in a vacuum. It was influenced by the cultures and peoples of the Middle East at that time. It developed its belief system and its practices by observing what other communities were doing. For example, they observed child sacrifice in other cultures and then rejects it in their own. They asserted their free will to determine their own destiny, their own understanding of God, and their way of behaving in the world. And today, we also rail against those who would take away the free will of others. In honor of Martin Luther King Jr., we remember that the black community did not have the opportunity to choose for themselves. Laws were passed to oppress and keep them in their place, just as Pharaoh tried to keep the Israelites in theirs. There are many ways in which people attempt to take away rights and choices from others, but as human beings, we all have the right to choose our own path, to make our own choices. The Me Too movement is an example of one person taking another's free will and the abuse of power by one person over another. Voter suppression is another example of taking away people's rights to choose for themselves. And then there's discrimination, child abuse, slavery, and genocide in our world today. This past week, 100 rabbis protested on the floor of the U.S. Capitol in support of DACA. And right now, in cities across America, and just around the corner from us in Santa Ana, thousands of women and men and children are marching. They are marching to make sure their freedom to choose their own destinies is not taken away from them. They are marching to give voice to those who are suppressed and can't speak for themselves. How does our ancient text speak to us today? It reminds us that we too were once enslaved, and now we are free. And therefore, it is our responsibility to make sure that the widow, the orphan, the alien, the other are also free. We have seen how other cultures treat people and take away their free will. We have experienced it for ourselves. The Torah teaches us to listen, to be compassionate, to care for all human beings, because they are created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Maybe God doesn't need to act in our lives as God does in the Torah. We have our own power and our own voices to speak to those whose hearts are hard. Let's use our voices and be heard.